The room was too quiet for a place built to decide guilt. Not the respectful kind of quiet either, but the kind that presses in on your ears and makes you aware of every breath you take. I could hear mine inside my dress blues, steady and measured, the same rhythm I used on a firing line when everything else fell away. 3 officers sat behind the long table in front of me, uniforms perfect, expressions locked. Somewhere behind my back, a chair creaked. Someone cleared their throat and then thought better of it. The charges had already been read, each one spoken slowly, carefully, like they wanted the words to leave marks. Conduct unbecoming. Failure of leadership. Bringing discredit upon the service. No one raised their voice. They did not need to. The silence between sentences carried more weight than any shouting I had heard overseas. I kept my hands flat on my knees the way training had taught me, eyes forward, jaw set but still. I could feel it in the room, the waiting. Waiting for me to flinch, waiting for anger, waiting for fear. Then the senior officer leaned forward and asked the question they believed would end everything. The question the entire case was built on. I took one slow breath. And I answered. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. My name is Lieutenant Commander Rachel Donovan, United States Navy. By the time everything unraveled, it was the spring of 2014, and I was stationed at a logistics command outside a small coastal installation near Port Halloway, North Carolina. I had been in uniform for more than a decade, long enough to understand a hard truth most people never see. In the military, bullets might end lives, but paperwork can end careers faster and more quietly than anything else. What happened to me did not begin in a courtroom, and it did not begin with accusations. It began months earlier, far from North Carolina, during a joint support operation that never made headlines and never would. No flags, no speeches, no footage. Just long days, longer nights, and a responsibility chain that stretched across time zones. Our job was simple on paper and brutal in reality. We coordinated medical evacuation timelines, supply corridors, and movement windows for multiple units operating in an unforgiving region where delays did not just create inconvenience, they created casualties. I was not kicking down doors or riding in convoys. My battlefield was a planning cell lit by fluorescent lights and computer screens that never went dark. My tools were maps, timestamps, clearance requests, and radios that crackled at all hours. I signed off on routes, synchronized air and ground movement, and made sure people I would never meet had what they needed before something went wrong. It was the kind of work no one noticed when it went right, and everyone blamed when it did not. The pressure never stopped. Orders arrived layered with conditions and legal language, written by people far from the ground. Intelligence updates changed by the hour, sometimes by the minute. A road that was clear at dawn could be compromised by afternoon. A landing zone approved in the morning could be unusable by nightfall. Command wanted speed. The units in the field wanted certainty. Both were understandable. Neither was fully possible. Somewhere between those demands, decisions had to be made. Those decisions were not abstract. They had names attached to them. They had times. They had consequences. And they had signatures. Mine was on more than one. I remember the moment things shifted, though I did not know it at the time. An extraction window for a medical evacuation closed early because of deteriorating conditions. Weather moved faster than forecast. Air assets were redirected. At the same time, a ground convoy was forced to reroute due to a last-minute threat update. The reroute request came through incomplete, missing a clearance that normally would have been routine. Waiting for it would have meant missing the only viable window left. I weighed the information I had, the information I did not, and the cost of hesitation. I made the call. The convoy moved. The evacuation timeline adjusted. The mission continued. No one died. No vehicles were lost. No reports were filed that night calling it a failure. Weeks later, Back in North Carolina, the tone changed. Questions started to surface, not about outcomes, but about process. Why had the adjustment been approved without the final clearance attached? Why had the timeline shifted ahead of written confirmation? Why had I acted when guidance was still being clarified? At first, it felt routine. Clarification requests, administrative review. I provided logs, emails, timestamp communications. Everything was documented. Every decision trail was there in black and white. The more information I supplied, the quieter the questions became. That silence should have been reassuring. It was not. In the military, silence from leadership rarely means resolution. It usually means direction has already been chosen. I started noticing changes that had nothing to do with paperwork. Meetings I used to lead were reassigned without explanation. Decisions that normally crossed my desk bypassed me entirely. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. No one accused me openly. No one defended me either. Eventually, I was called into a small office with no windows and told, carefully and politely, that leadership needed to understand accountability. That phrase mattered. Accountability does not always mean the truth. Sometimes, it means identifying a name that can absorb impact without damaging the structure above it. An extraction window closing early and a convoy rerouting without updated clearance needed an explanation. Leadership needed a reason. They found one. The first sign that something was wrong did not come overseas. It came back home. I was called into a small office with no windows and beige walls that smelled faintly of old paper and burnt coffee. The door closed softly behind me, and the officer across the desk spoke in a careful, measured tone, the kind people use when they think they are being kind. They said questions were being asked, not about the mission itself, about me, about my tone in emails, about how decisive I sounded, about whether I had acted beyond guidance instead of within it. Nothing was written down. Nothing was official. There were no charges, no paperwork, no timeline, just conversations framed as concern. Advice framed as mentorship. I was told this was routine, that leadership only wanted clarity. I nodded, thanked them, and went back to my desk feeling something tighten in my chest that I could not quite name yet. That night, and every night after, I pulled my logs back up. I cross-checked timestamps, message chains, approvals, call records. I traced each decision back to the moment it was made and the information available at the time. Everything was there, clean, documented, clear. The kind of record-keeping they teach you to maintain for exactly this reason. And yet, the more complete my records were, the quieter the questions became. At first, I thought that meant it was working, that the facts were speaking for themselves. But silence in the military is rarely neutral. Silence means something is moving without you. It means conversations are happening in rooms you are not invited into. That quiet began to feel heavier than the questions had. Word traveled faster than any memo ever could. I noticed it in small, ordinary ways. Conversations that stopped when I walked into a space, a pause that lasted just a second too long. People who used to meet my eyes suddenly focusing on their phones or papers. Meetings I had planned to run reassigned without explanation. Decisions rerouted around my desk as if it were no longer there. I was still doing my job. I was still in uniform every morning. But the authority that came with my position had been hollowed out slowly, carefully, so no single moment stood out as the cause. No one accused me outright. No one defended me either. That was what hurt the most. In a system built on rank and clarity, ambiguity is its own punishment. I started choosing my words more carefully, rereading emails before sending them, stripping anything that could be interpreted as confidence or urgency. Even then, it felt like every sentence was being read for subtext instead of meaning. The pressure followed me home. I slept less. When I did sleep, my mind replayed timelines and conversations instead of missions. I wondered which decision, which sentence, which moment had tipped the balance. I wondered if it had ever really been about that mission at all. One afternoon, a senior officer I trusted asked me to walk with them. We stopped outside, where the air smelled like salt and diesel from the nearby docks. They spoke quietly, not looking at me at first. They said they had seen this before, that situations like mine rarely stayed informal for long. Then they said something that shifted everything. They told me I should prepare. Not for clarification, not for resolution, for defense. The word settled between us, heavy and unmistakable. In that moment, I understood that this was no longer about correcting a process or reviewing a decision. It was about containment, about managing impact, about making sure responsibility landed somewhere safe for the institution, even if it was not fair to the individual. As we stood there, I realized something else. The questions about my tone, my decisiveness, my judgment were not accidental. They were framing. They were shaping a story where outcomes mattered less than perception, and perception could be adjusted to fit a need. I walked back to my office knowing that whatever came next would not be quick, and it would not be clean. The system was already moving, and I was no longer part of the conversation shaping it. From that day on, I stopped waiting for it to blow over. I started preparing for the truth to be tested in a way that had nothing to do with facts alone. The investigation moved forward without me in the room, and that absence was intentional. Statements were taken in closed offices. Email chains were printed, highlighted, and rearranged. Excerpts were lifted out and placed side by side, stripped of the moments that explained why they existed in the first place. Decisions that had been discussed, approved, and shared across multiple levels quietly became singular. Mine. I was advised to stay quiet, to let the process work, to trust that the system corrected itself when given time. I had heard that advice before, given to others who never quite recovered. Still, I followed it. I stopped volunteering explanations. I answered only what was asked, exactly as asked. Silence, I was told, would protect me. But the process already had a direction. I could feel it in the repetition of the questions, how they circled the same narrow point again and again. Why had I approved a timeline adjustment when written guidance was still in progress? Why had I not delayed until final confirmation arrived? Why had I taken responsibility instead of passing the decision upward and letting someone else own it? No one asked what information I had at the time. No one asked what waiting would have cost. No one asked how often delays had resulted in worse outcomes during that deployment. The questions were not designed to understand a decision. They were designed to isolate one. What went unspoken mattered more than anything that was said. No one asked what would have happened if I had waited. If I had chosen the safety of my career over urgency for people I could not see and would never meet. No one asked whether hesitation would have closed the window entirely, or whether caution would have felt like comfort only to the people reviewing paperwork weeks later. As draft charges began to circulate, I realized something else that had nothing to do with timelines or clearances. The language being used to describe me was changing. I was no longer framed as an officer who made a difficult call under pressure. I was framed as someone who acted emotionally, impulsively, too confident. They used words like judgment and temperament, carefully chosen and easy to defend on paper, words that sounded neutral but carried weight. Words that had followed women in uniform for generations, used to question authority without ever challenging competence directly. Reading those summaries, I felt something shift. Not anger, not fear. Something quieter. Clarity. I understood then that this was not just about one decision. It was about how that decision fit a narrative that already existed, one that made my choice easier to question because of who I was. That understanding did not make me raise my voice or argue harder. It did the opposite. It made me very calm. Calm in a way that comes when you stop hoping the system will recognize fairness on its own. Calm in a way that comes when you realize the only thing you truly control is how clearly you can explain the truth when your moment finally comes. I started organizing everything again, not to convince anyone behind closed doors, but to prepare for the day I would be asked to speak out loud. I reviewed timelines not to defend myself emotionally, but to understand them so completely that no question could shake me. I reminded myself why I had made the call in the first place, without justifying it, without apologizing for it. The investigation continued, methodical and distant. My name moved through documents and conversations while I remained on the outside, waiting. I could feel the shape of what was coming even before it was formally announced. And in that waiting, I stopped trying to prove I belonged. I focused instead on being ready to answer, calmly and clearly, when the room finally turned back toward me. When the decision was finally made to proceed with a full military court, it did not arrive with drama. It came in a short, carefully worded conversation that laid out my options as if they were doing me a favor. I could accept a lesser administrative outcome, a quiet resolution, no trial, no public record cleared, just a career that ended without noise or explanation. I would be reassigned, eventually separated, and the issue would disappear along with me. I understood what they were offering. Silence in exchange for survival. An ending without scrutiny, but also without truth. I said no, not because I believed I would win. By that point, I knew better than to confuse confidence with certainty. I said no because I knew exactly why I had made the decision I made, and I could live with the consequences of the truth far more easily than I could live with the weight of a lie I was expected to carry quietly. Accepting that option would have meant agreeing, without saying it out loud, that I had done something wrong. I had not. Once that choice was made, the tone shifted. The case stopped being abstract and became personal. I was assigned legal counsel, professional and direct. During our first long meeting, they did not sugarcoat anything. They told me what it would feel like to sit in that room, how the questions would not stay limited to timelines and procedures, how they would examine my character as carefully as my decisions. They warned me that calm would be framed as coldness, that confidence would be reframed as arrogance, that any moment of hesitation would be interpreted as doubt, and any firmness would be interpreted as defiance. They told me this was not unusual. They told me to be ready. I listened. I did not argue. I did not try to sound brave. I understood then that this was not just about defending a decision. It was about enduring a process designed to test how much pressure I could carry without breaking posture. I prepared the only way I knew how. I went back to the work itself. I rebuilt the timelines from memory until they were second nature. I memorized communications not as text, but as sequences of moments. Who called? When? What information was available at that exact time? What was missing? What could not wait? I slept less, not from panic, but from repetition. I would wake up and run through the sequence again, checking it against my notes. I spoke less at work, conserving energy, avoiding anything that could be misinterpreted or misremembered. I focused on facts because facts do not change under pressure. Feelings do. As the trial date approached, people treated me differently. Some with sympathy they did not voice. Some with distance they did not explain. I accepted both without comment. My world narrowed to preparation and discipline. By the time I put my dress blues on and walked toward the courtroom, something unexpected had happened. The fear I thought I would feel never arrived. In its place was something steadier. Readiness. I was not walking in to argue. I was not walking in to impress anyone. I was walking in to answer. And for the first time since the questions had begun, that felt like enough. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined it would be. No flags lining the walls, no raised voices or dramatic gestures. Just polished wood, rows of chairs, and uniforms arranged with careful precision. It felt less like a place where truth was weighed and more like a place where procedure was performed. I took my seat and kept my posture still, aware of how every movement could be read as something it was not. Witnesses were called one by one. Each spoke carefully, choosing words the way people do when they know their statements will be dissected later. Some looked at me when they spoke. Some kept their eyes fixed on the table or the far wall. No one lied outright. They did not have to. Truth can be bent without being broken. The prosecution built their case slowly, methodically. They stacked moments without context, laying them out in a neat line that suggested a pattern of recklessness. A timeline adjustment here, a reroute approval there. They emphasized what was missing rather than what was present, what was not attached, what was not final. By leaving out the pressure, the pace, and the conditions of that deployment, they painted a picture that looked complete if you did not know where to look. I listened without reacting. Every instinct I had told me to explain, to interrupt, to correct small inaccuracies before they hardened into assumptions. Training kept me still. I let my counsel handle objections. I kept my eyes forward and my hands steady. I reminded myself that explanations offered too early can sound like excuses. As the hours passed, the room seemed to tighten. The air felt heavier, not with tension, but with expectation. This was the part everyone had been waiting for, when the focus would finally shift from documents and witnesses to me. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and walked to the designated spot, aware of the sound of my shoes against the floor. The senior officer presiding over the court leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table. Their voice was calm, almost conversational, which made the question land harder. They asked why I had not waited for written clarification, why I had approved a timeline adjustment when guidance was still being finalized, why I had acted when there was uncertainty instead of delaying until everything was confirmed. The room went very still. I could feel eyes on me from every direction, not hostile, but assessing. This was the question the entire case revolved around, the one everything else had been arranged to support. In that moment, everything narrowed. The months of investigation, the quiet conversations, the highlighted excerpts and missing context, all compressed into a single point. There was no room for philosophy or defense strategy, just the decision as it existed in real time and the reason behind it. I took one breath and felt the calm I had been carrying settle fully into place. I was no longer thinking about careers or outcomes or how my answer would be received. I was thinking about the moment the decision was made, the information I had, and the responsibility that came with it. When I began to speak, it was not rushed. It was not rehearsed. It was simply true. I told them the truth, without softening it, and without dressing it up to sound safer than it was. I said that waiting would have closed the window entirely. I said that the guidance they were referencing arrived after the decision point, not before it. I explained that in that moment, delay was not a neutral choice. It was an action of its own, one that carried consequences just as real as moving forward. I spoke about timelines the way they existed then, not the way they looked weeks later on paper. I explained how conditions were changing faster than approvals could travel, how the people on the ground did not have the luxury of waiting for perfect clarity. They had what they had, when they had it, and they depended on us to act inside that reality, not an ideal one. I did not raise my voice. I did not apologize. I did not blame anyone else. I owned the decision exactly as it had been made. Then I said something I knew they were not expecting. I said that if I were placed back in that same moment, with the same information and the same constraints, I would make the same call again. The room shifted slightly at that, not visibly, but enough that I felt it. There is an expectation in those settings that you will show regret, or at least distance yourself from the choice, that you will frame it as a lesson learned, something you would now do differently. I did not do that. I told them it was not because the decision was perfect. It was not. It was made under pressure, with incomplete information, and it carried risk. But it was necessary. And leadership, real leadership, does not mean choosing the option that best protects your own future. It means choosing responsibility when someone has to. I said that passing the decision upward would not have changed the outcome, only the name attached to it. I said that waiting for final confirmation would have felt safer to the people reviewing it later, but it would not have been safer for the people depending on us in real time. No one interrupted me. No one pushed back. There were no follow-up questions designed to corner me or expose hesitation. The room stayed silent in a way that felt different from before, not heavy. Still, I could hear pens moving across paper. I could hear pages being turned. No one looked angry. No one looked relieved. They were simply listening. In that stillness, something settled inside me. I realized that regardless of how they ruled, the shape of the story had changed. Until that moment, the narrative had been about recklessness versus compliance, about deviation versus discipline. But now there was another version of events on the record, one that could not be reduced to highlighted excerpts or missing attachments. I had not tried to defend myself by minimizing the decision. I had not tried to shift responsibility or wrap my answer in policy language. I had said plainly why I acted and what it meant to me as an officer. As I finished speaking, I felt no rush of relief, just a quiet certainty that I had done what I could. Whatever happened next would not erase that moment or the clarity that came with it. When I sat back down, my hands were steady. My breathing was slow. I did not look around the room to gauge reactions. I did not need to. For the first time since the process had begun, I was no longer waiting to be judged. I had already measured myself against the decision that mattered. Even if the ruling went against me, I knew I would leave that room without carrying doubt. The outcome could shape my career, but it could not rewrite the reason I was there. In that silence, with nothing left to add and nothing left to explain, I understood something clearly. Truth does not always win quickly, and it does not always win publicly. But once it is spoken plainly and without fear, it changes the ground everyone else has to stand on. The verdict did not come that day. It arrived later, delivered without ceremony, as if the months leading up to it had not existed. The charges did not hold. The record reflected that in precise language, clean and official. On paper, it looked like resolution. In reality, it was only an ending to one part of the story. Being cleared did not rewind time. It did not return the nights spent awake replaying timelines or the quiet distance that had settled around me at work. The strain lingered in ways that were hard to explain to anyone who had not lived inside it. I felt it in how my shoulders stayed tense even after the case was over, in how I measured my words long after there was no longer a reason to. Some doors reopened. Meetings I had been excluded from began to include my name again. Assignments that had quietly passed me by returned, cautiously. Other doors never moved. Opportunities that required unspoken trust stayed closed, their absence never acknowledged. No one apologized. No one explained. That was not how the system worked. I stayed in the Navy. Leaving would have been easier in some ways, but it would have felt like allowing the experience to define the end of my service. Instead, I stayed, and I carried the weight of it with me. I was not the same officer I had been before. I was quieter, more deliberate. I listened longer before speaking. I documented everything with an almost clinical precision. I trusted my instincts even more than I had before, because they had been tested under pressure and held. At the same time, I trusted the institution a little less. Not in its mission, but in its willingness to protect individuals when responsibility became inconvenient. That shift did not make me cynical. It made me realistic. Every decision after that carried a new layer of awareness. Not fear of consequences, but clarity of purpose. I asked myself the same question each time. Do I understand why I am acting? Can I stand by this choice even if I am the only one who has to own it later? If the answer was yes, I moved forward. If it was not, I waited. I became more patient with junior officers who hesitated and more direct with those who avoided responsibility. I understood better how easy it is to judge decisions from a distance with all the information neatly arranged after the fact. I made a point of asking what someone knew at the time, not what they wished they had known later. The experience changed how I defined success. It was no longer tied to recognition or advancement. It was tied to integrity, to leaving each situation knowing I had acted for the right reasons, even if those reasons were invisible to everyone else. There were moments, quiet ones, when the isolation returned. When I wondered if the cost had been too high. Those moments passed, not because the answer changed, but because the question no longer mattered. The decision had already been made, and it had shaped me into an officer who understood the weight of leadership more fully than before. Looking back, I do not remember the verdict as clearly as I remember the months surrounding it. The silence, the distance, the realization that doing the right thing does not guarantee protection. What stays with me is not relief, but resolve. The lesson I carried forward was not about fear or caution. It was about clarity, about knowing why you act and being willing to carry that reason with you, even when no one thanks you for it, and even when the cost is higher than you expected. I do not remember every word spoken in that courtroom, and I do not try to. What I remember is the feeling of sitting there and choosing honesty over comfort when it would have been easier to soften the truth. I remember answering calmly when everything in that moment carried weight, knowing that once the words left my mouth, I could not take them back. Service is often described in terms of sacrifice overseas, long deployments, or moments of visible danger. But some of the most defining moments never happen in uniform under open skies. They happen in quiet rooms, behind closed doors, when standing alone feels heavier than any external threat. They happen when you defend decisions made in silence for people who will never know your name or what it costs you to act on their behalf. I did not walk away untouched. None of us do when we carry responsibility long enough. The experience changed how I see leadership, accountability, and trust. It stripped away the illusion that doing the right thing always comes with protection or gratitude. What it left me with was something steadier. I walked away intact. My career continued, but more importantly, my sense of who I was as an officer remained whole. That mattered more than winning, more than being cleared, more than hearing the right words on paper. That moment stays with me because it reminds me that integrity is not loud. It does not argue or perform. It waits, and when asked, it answers plainly, without fear or apology. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from.